The winter of 1847 had arrived early in the Montana Territory, bringing with it a merciless cold that could freeze a man's breath before it left his lips. Jack Morrison, a weathered cowboy with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's harsh realities, guided his horse through the snow-laden pine forest. The wind howled like a banshee through the towering evergreens, their branches heavy with fresh powder that fell in silent cascades whenever the gusts grew too strong. Jack pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his shoulders, the familiar creak of the material mixing with the rhythmic crunch of his horse's hooves, breaking through the crystalline surface. He had been riding for 3 days straight, delivering a message from the territorial governor to the mining camp at Silver Creek, and now he was finally heading home to his small cabin near Billings. The job paid well enough to keep him fed through the winter months, though it meant spending long hours alone in the wilderness with only his thoughts and the endless expanse of white for company. As he navigated around a fallen log that blocked the narrow trail, something caught his eye in the distance. At first, he thought it might be a wounded animal, perhaps a deer that had been caught by wolves and left to die, but as he drew closer, his heart nearly stopped. There, half buried in a snowdrift beneath a massive pine tree, lay the small, motionless form of a child. Jack dismounted quickly, his boots sinking deep into the snow as he rushed toward the figure. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, his dark hair matted with ice crystals, and his lips already turning blue from the cold. His clothing marked him as Cherokee. The intricate beadwork on his leather vest and the traditional moccasins on his feet told Jack everything he needed to know about the child's heritage. The boy's breathing was so shallow it was barely visible, and his skin had taken on the waxy pallor that Jack recognized as the early stages of freezing to death. Without hesitation, Jack scooped the child into his arms, feeling how light and fragile he seemed against his chest. The boy's body was ice cold, and Jack could feel the life slowly ebbing away from him with each labored breath. There was no time to waste. The nearest Cherokee settlement was at least 2 days' ride away, but Jack's own cabin was only 6 miles through the forest. He would have to take the boy there and hope he could warm him up enough to save his life. Hey there, friend. Before we continue with this incredible story of courage and destiny, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying this tale from the Old West. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I love connecting with viewers from all around the world. Jack wrapped the unconscious boy in his own heavy coat and carefully lifted him onto his horse, holding him securely against his chest as they began the treacherous journey through the deepening snow. The wind had picked up considerably, turning the falling snow into a blinding whirlwind that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Jack's horse, a sturdy Mustang named Thunder, seemed to sense the urgency of their mission and picked his way carefully through the drifts, his breath creating great clouds of vapor in the frigid air. As they rode, Jack found himself talking to the unconscious child, partly to keep himself alert, and partly because he hoped his voice might somehow reach through the boy's fading consciousness. He told him about the warm fire waiting at the cabin, about the hot soup he would prepare, about how everything would be all right once they reached safety. The boy's head lolled against Jack's shoulder, and several times Jack had to check to make sure he was still breathing. The journey that normally took an hour and a half stretched into nearly 3 hours as Jack navigated through the storm. By the time his cabin came into view, a small dark shape against the white landscape with smoke curling from its chimney, Jack's own hands were numb with cold and his face stung from the wind-driven snow. He had kept a fire burning in the hearth before he left, banking the coals carefully so they would still be glowing when he returned. Jack carried the boy inside and immediately set about trying to save his life. He stripped away the child's wet clothing and wrapped him in every blanket he owned, then placed him close to the fireplace, where the warmth could gradually penetrate his frozen body. He heated water on the stove and prepared a weak broth, knowing that if the boy regained consciousness, he would need something warm in his stomach. For the next several hours, Jack worked tirelessly, massaging the child's hands and feet to restore circulation, checking his breathing, and adding wood to the fire to keep the cabin as warm as possible. It wasn't until well past midnight that the boy's eyes finally fluttered open. He looked around the unfamiliar cabin with confusion and fear, his dark eyes wide, as they took in Jack's weathered face illuminated by the firelight. Jack spoke to him gently in the few Cherokee words he knew, trying to reassure him that he was safe. The boy was too weak to speak much, but Jack could see the intelligence and strength in his young face, even through his exhaustion and lingering hypothermia. Over the next 3 days, Jack nursed the boy back to health. He learned that the child's name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in Cherokee, and that he had become separated from his family's hunting party during the blizzard. The boy had wandered for hours in the snow before collapsing beneath the pine tree where Jack found him. As Ayana grew stronger, Jack could see the fierce pride and dignity that marked him as the son of a prominent Cherokee family. There was something regal about the way he carried himself, even as a child, that suggested he came from a line of leaders. When the storm finally passed and the trails became passable again, Jack knew it was time to return Ayana to his people. The Cherokee settlement was located in a valley about 40 miles to the southeast, nestled among rolling hills that provided protection from the harsh winter winds. Jack had traded with the Cherokee before and knew they were an honorable people who valued courage and integrity above all else. The journey to the Cherokee settlement took them through some of the most beautiful country Jack had ever seen. The snow had transformed the landscape into a pristine wonderland, with every tree branch and rock formation outlined in white against the brilliant blue sky. Ayana rode behind Jack on Thunder, his small arms wrapped around the cowboy's waist as they made their way through valleys and over ridges that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. As they approached the Cherokee village, Jack could see smoke rising from numerous lodges and the figures of people moving about their daily tasks. Dogs began barking as they rode into the settlement, and soon they were surrounded by curious faces, men, women, and children who had come to see who was arriving. When Ayana slid down from the horse and ran toward a group of adults, Jack heard cries of joy and relief that needed no translation. An elderly man who was clearly a person of great importance approached Jack. His hair was silver white and braided with feathers and beads, and his face bore the lines of wisdom and experience. Through a mixture of broken English and hand gestures, Jack learned that this was Ayana's grandfather, Chief Running Bear, and that the boy was not just any child. He was the grandson of the tribal leader and destined to one day lead his people himself. Chief Running Bear grasped Jack's hand in both of his own, his eyes filled with tears of gratitude as he spoke in Cherokee. Though Jack couldn't understand all the words, the meaning was clear. The chief was thanking him for saving his grandson's life and promising that this debt would never be forgotten. The old man placed a hand on Jack's shoulder and spoke a few words in English. "You saved my blood. Cherokee people remember, always remember." Jack stayed in the village for 2 days, accepting the hospitality of Ayana's family and learning more about Cherokee customs and traditions. He was struck by the dignity and wisdom of these people, their deep connection to the land, and their strong sense of honor and family loyalty. When it came time to leave, Ayana ran to him and pressed a small carved wooden eagle into his hand, a gift that the boy had made himself as a token of gratitude. As Jack rode away from the Cherokee settlement, he carried with him not just the memory of a good deed done, but a profound respect for the people who had welcomed him into their community. He tucked the wooden eagle into his saddlebag and thought no more about it, assuming that his paths and those of the Cherokee would never cross again. The frontier was vast, and men often disappeared into its immensity like stones dropped into a deep well. The years that followed were typical of life on the frontier, a mixture of hard work, small victories, and occasional setbacks that tested a man's resolve. Jack continued working as a messenger and occasional ranch hand, moving from town to town as opportunities arose. He witnessed the rapid changes that were transforming the West as more settlers arrived. Railroads pushed across the plains, and the old ways of life began to give way to progress and civilization. By 1862, Jack had settled in the growing town of Clearwater Falls, a bustling community that had sprung up around a lumber mill and a silver mine. The town boasted a main street lined with businesses, a church, a school, and even a small newspaper. Jack had found steady work at the lumber mill and had managed to save enough money to rent a small house on the outskirts of town. For the first time in years, he felt like he might actually be putting down roots somewhere. It was during this period of relative stability that Jack's life took a dramatic and unexpected turn. The trouble began with the arrival of Marcus Whitman, a wealthy businessman from back east who had come to Clearwater Falls with plans to expand the mining operations and build a railroad spur to connect the town with the main transcontinental line. Whitman was a man accustomed to getting his way, and he had little patience for anyone who stood in the path of his ambitions. The conflict started over a piece of land that Jack had been hoping to purchase, a small plot on the edge of town where he planned to build a proper house and maybe start a small ranch. Jack had been saving money for months and had already spoken with the current owner about a fair price. But when Whitman arrived in town, he immediately set his sights on the same piece of property, seeing it as the perfect location for a new rail depot. Whitman's first approach was to try to buy Jack out, offering him what seemed like a generous sum to abandon his claim to the land. When Jack politely declined, explaining that he had already made arrangements with the owner, Whitman's demeanor changed completely. The businessman made it clear that he was not accustomed to being told no, and that he would find a way to get what he wanted, with or without Jack's cooperation. What Jack didn't realize was that Whitman had connections throughout the territorial government and was not above using underhanded tactics to achieve his goals. Within a week of their confrontation, Jack found himself facing a series of mysterious problems. His employer at the lumber mill suddenly claimed that tools had gone missing and accused Jack of theft. The local sheriff, who had always been friendly toward Jack, began treating him with suspicion and hostility. Rumors began circulating around town that Jack was involved in various criminal activities, though no one could ever provide any concrete evidence. The situation came to a head on a cold February morning when Jack was awakened by loud pounding on his door. Sheriff Coleman stood on his porch with 2 deputies, holding a warrant for Jack's arrest. The charge was murder, specifically the killing of a traveling merchant named Samuel Hayes, who had been found dead on the trail outside of town 3 days earlier. Hayes had been shot in the back and robbed of a considerable sum of money that he had been carrying to purchase supplies for his general store. Jack was stunned by the accusation. He had never even met Samuel Hayes, and on the night of the murder, he had been at home reading by his fireplace, as he did most evenings. But when he tried to explain this to Sheriff Coleman, the lawman simply shook his head and told him to save his story for the judge. As Jack was led away in shackles, he caught sight of Marcus Whitman standing across the street, watching the proceedings with a satisfied smile on his face. The trial, if it could even be called that, was a mockery of justice. The territorial judge was a friend of Whitman's, and the jury was composed entirely of men who either worked for the businessman or owed him money. The prosecution's case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of witnesses who claimed to have seen Jack in the area where Hayes was killed, though their stories were full of contradictions and obvious lies. Jack's court-appointed lawyer was young and inexperienced, clearly intimidated by the powerful forces arrayed against his client. He made a half-hearted attempt to present Jack's side of the story, but it was obvious that the outcome had been decided before the trial even began. The judge seemed bored by the proceedings, frequently checking his pocket watch and making it clear that he wanted to get the whole business over with as quickly as possible. When the jury returned their verdict, after less than an hour of deliberation, no one in the courtroom was surprised to hear the word guilty ring out across the packed room. The judge immediately sentenced Jack to death by hanging, to be carried out in 3 days' time in the town square. As the gavel came down with a final, decisive bang, Jack felt the last of his hope drain away like water from a broken bucket. The next 3 days passed in a blur of despair and resignation. Jack sat in his cell, staring out through the barred window at the gallows that the townspeople were constructing in the square. He could hear the sound of hammers and saws as they built the platform that would soon be the site of his execution. Groups of curious onlookers gathered throughout the day to examine the structure and speculate about the upcoming hanging, treating it like a form of entertainment rather than the taking of a human life. Jack's thoughts during those final days turned often to the life he had lived and the choices he had made. He thought about his childhood on a small farm in Ohio, about the dreams that had brought him west in search of adventure and opportunity, about the friends he had made and lost along the way. He thought about Ayanna, the Cherokee boy he had saved from the snow 15 years earlier, and wondered what had become of him. That memory at least brought him some comfort. Regardless of how his own story ended, he knew that he had done at least one truly good thing in his life. On the morning of his execution, Jack was awakened before dawn by the sound of people gathering in the square outside his window. Word of the hanging had spread throughout the territory, and folks had come from miles around to witness the spectacle. Vendors had set up stalls selling food and drink, and children ran through the crowd playing games and laughing, seemingly oblivious to the grim purpose of the gathering. Sheriff Coleman came to Jack's cell just after sunrise, accompanied by a preacher who offered to pray with the condemned man. Jack declined the religious comfort, preferring to spend his final moments in quiet contemplation rather than listening to platitudes about divine mercy and forgiveness. He had made his peace with whatever lay beyond death, and he faced his fate with the same stoic courage that had carried him through all the hardships of frontier life. As they led him from the jail to the gallows, Jack was struck by the size of the crowd that had assembled to watch him die. There had to be at least 300 people packed into the town square, their faces a mixture of curiosity, excitement, and morbid fascination. He spotted Marcus Whitman, standing near the front of the crowd, dressed in his finest clothes and looking like a man who was about to enjoy a particularly satisfying meal. The gallows platform stood about 8 feet high, with 13 steps leading up to the trapdoor where Jack would meet his end. The rope had already been prepared and tested, hanging ominously from the crossbeam like a snake waiting to strike. As Jack climbed the steps, his legs felt strangely detached from his body, as if he were watching someone else walk to their death. The preacher followed him onto the platform and began reading from his Bible, his voice carrying across the silent crowd as he spoke about redemption and eternal judgment. Jack barely heard the words. His attention focused instead on the horizon beyond the town, where the mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the morning sky. He had always loved those mountains, and he was grateful that they would be the last thing his eyes would see. Sheriff Coleman positioned Jack on the trapdoor and placed the noose around his neck, adjusting it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed this task many times before. The rope felt rough against Jack's skin, and he could smell the hemp fibers that would soon cut off his breath forever. The sheriff asked if he had any last words, and Jack simply shook his head, preferring to maintain his dignity in silence. Just as Sheriff Coleman reached for the lever that would open the trapdoor, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. People began pointing and shouting, their voices filled with alarm and confusion. Jack looked up to see what was causing the disturbance, and his heart nearly stopped at the sight that greeted his eyes. Riding into the town square with the bearing of a conquering army came a group of Cherokee warriors, their horses moving in perfect formation as they approached the gallows. At their head rode a tall, powerfully built man whose very presence seemed to command the attention of every person in the crowd. He was dressed in traditional Cherokee regalia, with eagle feathers in his long black hair and intricate beadwork covering his leather shirt and leggings. War paint adorned his face in bold stripes of red and black, and his dark eyes burned with an intensity that made even the bravest men in the crowd take a step backward. But it was not just the impressive appearance of this Cherokee leader that caused Jack's breath to catch in his throat. It was the sudden, overwhelming recognition of features that he had seen before, 15 years earlier, in the face of a small boy, half frozen in the snow. The man riding toward the gallows was Ayanna, the child Jack had saved from certain death in the Montana wilderness, now grown into a powerful chief who commanded the respect and loyalty of dozens of warriors. The Cherokee riders formed a semicircle around the gallows, their horses snorting and pawing the ground as they came to a halt. The crowd of townspeople, who moments before had been eagerly anticipating an execution, now found themselves face to face with a force that could easily overwhelm them if violence erupted. The warriors sat motionless on their mounts, their hands resting casually on their weapons as they waited for their chief to speak. Ayanna, now known by his adult name of Chief Soaring Eagle, dismounted from his horse with fluid grace and walked slowly toward the gallows platform. His eyes never left Jack's face as he approached, and Jack could see in them the same intelligence and strength that had impressed him so many years ago, now matured into the wisdom and authority of a true leader. The chief's presence was so commanding that even Sheriff Coleman seemed uncertain about how to proceed. When Chief Soaring Eagle reached the base of the gallows, he stopped and looked up at Jack with an expression that was both solemn and filled with deep emotion. Then, in a voice that carried clearly across the silent square, he began to speak in English, his words carefully chosen and delivered with the gravity of a man who understood the weight of the moment. 15 winters ago, the chief began, his voice resonating with quiet power, a white man found a Cherokee boy dying in the snow. This man could have ridden past, could have left the child to freeze and die alone in the wilderness, but he did not. He risked his own life to save a stranger, asking for nothing in return, expecting no reward for his kindness. The crowd listened in stunned silence as Chief Soaring Eagle continued his story, describing in vivid detail how Jack had carried the unconscious boy through the blizzard, nursed him back to health, and returned him safely to his people. Many in the crowd began to murmur among themselves, recognizing the truth in the chief's words and beginning to understand the significance of what was unfolding before them. "That boy," the chief said, his voice growing stronger, "grew up to become the leader of his people. He never forgot the debt he owed to the man who saved his life, and now he sees that same man about to die for a crime he did not commit, condemned by the lies of cowards who hide behind false justice." Chief Soaring Eagle turned to address the crowd directly, his eyes sweeping across the faces of the townspeople, with a gaze that seemed to see into their very souls. "The Cherokee people know this man's heart," he declared. "We know his honor, his courage, his willingness to help those in need. He is not a murderer. He is a hero who deserves your respect, not your rope." Marcus Whitman, who had been standing near the front of the crowd, suddenly pushed forward, his face red with anger and indignation. "This is preposterous," he shouted. "You can't just ride into our town and interfere with our legal proceedings. This man has been tried and convicted by a jury of his peers." Chief Soaring Eagle turned his attention to Whitman, and the businessman immediately took a step backward under the intensity of the chief's stare. "Your legal proceedings," the chief said with quiet contempt, "are built on lies and corruption. We know who truly killed the merchant Hayes. We know who paid for false testimony and bought a judge's verdict. The Cherokee have eyes and ears throughout this territory, and we see much that others think is hidden." The chief reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew a small object that glinted in the morning sunlight. It was a distinctive silver pocket watch, ornately engraved with initials that several people in the crowd immediately recognized. "This belonged to Samuel Hayes," Chief Soaring Eagle announced, holding the watch high for all to see. "It was taken from his body by his real killer, who thought he had hidden it well. But Cherokee trackers found it in the cabin of a man named Pete Rawlings, along with the money that was stolen from Hayes." A gasp went up from the crowd as people began to understand the implications of what the chief was revealing. Pete Rawlings was known to be one of Marcus Whitman's hired men, a rough character who was rumored to do the businessman's dirty work when more subtle methods failed. Several people in the crowd began looking around for Rawlings, but he was nowhere to be seen. Apparently, he had fled town as soon as he learned that the Cherokee were investigating the murder. "Furthermore," Chief Soaring Eagle continued, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade, "we have a witness who saw Rawlings shoot Hayes in the back and rob his body. This witness is prepared to testify before any honest court that will hear his words." Sheriff Coleman, who had been standing frozen on the gallows platform throughout this entire exchange, finally found his voice. "Even if what you say is true," he stammered, "I can't just release a condemned prisoner without proper legal authority. There are procedures that must be followed." Chief Soaring Eagle's response was swift and decisive. He gestured to his warriors, who immediately urged their horses forward, closing the circle around the gallows until they were within arm's reach of the platform. The message was clear. The Cherokee were not making a request. They were issuing an ultimatum. "The Cherokee Nation has treaties with the United States government," the chief said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable note of warning. "These treaties guarantee our right to protect our friends and allies from injustice. This man saved the life of a Cherokee child, making him forever a friend of our people. We will not allow him to be murdered by corrupt white men who care more about money than truth." The tension in the town square was now so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. The townspeople found themselves caught between their local authorities and a force of Cherokee warriors who clearly meant business. Many of them were beginning to have serious doubts about the justice of Jack's conviction, especially in light of the evidence that Chief Soaring Eagle had presented. It was at this moment that an unexpected voice joined the conversation. Judge Harrison, the territorial magistrate who had presided over Jack's trial, pushed through the crowd and approached the gallows. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. Whether from fear or guilt, no one could say. I may have been too hasty in my judgment," the judge said, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "If there is new evidence that calls into question the defendant's guilt, then perhaps the execution should be postponed pending a new investigation." Marcus Whitman whirled on the judge, his face contorted with rage. "You can't be serious," he snarled. "We had a deal. This man was supposed to hang today, and that's exactly what's going to happen." The businessman's words hung in the air like an admission of guilt, and several people in the crowd began to understand just how deeply the corruption ran. Chief Soaring Eagle smiled grimly. recognizing that Whitman had just provided the final piece of evidence needed to expose the conspiracy. "Sheriff Coleman," the chief said, his voice now carrying the authority of a man who expected to be obeyed, "remove the rope from this man's neck and release him immediately. If you refuse, my warriors and I will do it for you, and I cannot guarantee that the process will be as gentle as you might prefer." The sheriff looked around desperately, seeking guidance from someone in authority. But Judge Harrison had already begun backing away from the gallows, clearly unwilling to face the consequences of his corrupt decision. The crowd was growing increasingly restless, with many people now openly expressing their belief that Jack was innocent and that a terrible injustice was about to be committed. Finally, with obvious reluctance, Sheriff Coleman reached up and loosened the noose around Jack's neck, lifting it over his head and tossing it aside. The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry shouts as Jack was freed from his bonds and helped down from the gallows platform. His legs were shaky from the ordeal, but his spirit soared as he realized that he was going to live to see another day. Chief Soaring Eagle approached Jack and clasped his hand in a firm grip, his dark eyes filled with the satisfaction of a debt finally repaid. "My grandfather told me that a Cherokee never forgets a kindness," he said quietly, speaking so that only Jack could hear. "Today, I have honored his words and the memory of the man who saved my life when I was just a frightened child, lost in the snow." Jack felt tears welling up in his eyes as he looked into the face of the boy he had rescued so many years ago, now grown into a powerful leader who had risked everything to save him in return. "I never expected anything like this," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I just did what any decent man would do." "That," Chief Soaring Eagle replied with a slight smile, "is exactly why you deserve to be saved." The aftermath of that dramatic morning in Clearwater Falls would be talked about for generations to come. Marcus Whitman was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, along with bribery and corruption of public officials. Pete Rawlings was tracked down by Cherokee warriors and territorial marshals working together, and he eventually confessed to killing Samuel Hayes on Whitman's orders. Judge Harrison was removed from the bench and faced federal charges for his role in the conspiracy. Jack Morrison was not only exonerated of all charges, but was offered a substantial settlement by the territorial government as compensation for the injustice he had suffered. He used the money to purchase the piece of land that had started the whole conflict, and he built the house he had always dreamed of on a hill overlooking the valley. But perhaps more importantly, Jack had gained something that money could never buy, a friendship with Chief Soaring Eagle and the Cherokee people that would last for the rest of his life. The chief visited Jack's ranch several times over the years, and the two men would sit by the fire sharing stories of their adventures and reflecting on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. Years later, when Jack was an old man with grey hair and weathered hands, he would often take out the small wooden eagle that Ayanna had given him as a child and remember the day when a simple act of human kindness had saved not just one life, but two. He had learned that in the vast wilderness of the American frontier, where life could be harsh and unforgiving, the bonds of friendship and honor could transcend all boundaries of race and culture. The story of the cowboy and the Cherokee chief became a legend throughout the territory, passed down from generation to generation as an example of how one person's courage and compassion could change the course of history. It reminded people that in a world often dominated by greed and violence, there was still room for heroes who acted not for personal gain, but simply because it was the right thing to do. And somewhere in the mountains of Montana, where the snow still falls deep and white each winter, the spirits of two friends, one white, one Cherokee, continue to watch over travelers who might lose their way in the wilderness, ensuring that no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever truly forgotten.